Hello, my name is Bob Brown, and it's my privilege to host this show, which is based on the reality that Westborough is a great town filled with interesting people. Many of them are long-term residents who have so many memories and stories about life in Westborough in days gone past. And so your local cable station, Westborough TV, has initiated this series of programs which are designed to reflect upon life in earlier days and to possibly make suggestions about how we can improve life in this fine town for the future.
Well, I feel very fortunate that the outset of this program, we have Jack and Shirley Hero who have agreed to come be with us and talk a little bit about their experiences here in Westborough. As we said before, the theme of this is to understand what Westborough looks like to people who've lived here for a long time. I'd like to start with Jack and ask him if he'd be willing to tell us a little bit about his family here in town, because you have at least, what, 3 generations?
4 or 5.
4 or 5. Okay, go back to Columbus and start.
Well, the start of our family here in Westborough was Dr. Hero, Dr. John H. Hero. He was born in Milford, and after he grew up and got to be a doctor, he moved to Westborough. And he did a number of things. So one of the main things was he made medicine. He made cough drops and cough syrup and bitters and a few other things which could have been 90% alcohol, but I really don't know. I did find a couple of old formulas that I am going to take to one of the doctors to see if they can read them. So he didn't manufacture these cough drops in his own home. He had them manufactured, and they would be shipped into him in a barrel. And he would take the barrel down to the next door neighbor, who happened to be Austin Boynton, as a name from the past.
Okay.
And they would put them in packages. The other thing about his medical program, he would take a horse and wagon and travel through Connecticut and southern New Hampshire and Middlesex County, delivering these products to drugstores. The next thing he did was start the Willow Park Seminary. And that building was next to the Nathan Fisher House. It was facing Park Street, and it was torn down in the 1950s, which is kind of a shame because that was another piece of history for the town. It had been built by somebody named Wesson 50, 75 years before that, I guess, quite early. And as a result of that being the Western Tavern, that section of town was known as Wessonville. So the doctor started this water cure facility where bathing in the water at the right temperature and so forth was good for the system. It evolved out of that into a school, a real school, like a college, where they taught Latin and math and science. There were a number of teachers there, and the doctor was the manager, the president, and so forth. And those, that went on for 9 years, from the early 1880s, for 9 years before that school closed. But its reputation was not just as an academic school, it was a finishing school for young ladies where they would learn culture and so forth. And it was very popular, and they came from all over the country.
Just interrupt you a moment, Jack. Can you describe where it was? Was it where the 1875 house is?
No, it was beside the Nathan Fisher House, between the Nathan Fisher House and Park Street, which goes across Route 9 up to the Murphy.
So it was on the opposite side of Route 9 from the Lyman School.
No, Same side.
Same side, okay.
But on the other, on the other side of Park Street.
Right, okay,
But
gotcha.
yes,
Okay.
on the Lyman School grounds. Willow Park, that was the name of his seminary, and it's shown in the poster pictures. And the reason it was called Willow Park was that the doctor planted a row of willow trees on Park Street. So every other tree was a willow, and then a maple, then a willow, and a maple. And those were very prominent and pretty and talked about until they had a major ice storm in the 1890s that kind of cleaned them out. But the name stuck. The Nathan Fisher house was where he lived, on the side next to Park Street, and his two sons, Butler Wilmarth and George Hoyt, Hero, lived in the other side. Butler W., the son, married the housekeeper, and she was a West, from the West family in Westborough. So they lived in one side of the Nathan Fisher house for a number of years, and my dad was born in the Nathan Fisher house in 1891, and two sisters were also born there, a Florence Hero and a Marion Hero. We have some photographs of both the Nathan Fisher house and the Wesson Tavern, with the old doctor sitting out in front in both pictures. And one in the Nathan Fisher house, it had a family group, which had some West people and Hero people. The next thing about Westborough history with Dr. Hero was that he became a selectman in the early 1900s. And, before that even, he was elected postmaster of Westborough in 1894. And if people don't really know how those things used to work, you were elected, when a president was elected from your party, he would pick a man to be postmaster. So Butler Hero was retired in 4 years when the party changed. So as a result of that, we had a lot of stamps that he had collected, hopefully paid for.
Yeah.
And so then he became selectman. And one other thing, early 1800s, it's interesting too, the Westborough Creamery, I think that's the name. I had the stock certificate book for the Westborough Creamery. And the reason that I have all of these things is that the doctor and my grandfather, Butler, were real pack rats. They saved everything. And Butler Hero happened to be secretary of almost everything that went on in Westborough that I know about. So we had the stock book for the Westborough Creamery. And what that was, it was an organization so that the dairy farmers in Westborough could bring their milk to the railroad station, and they made a package shipment to Boston, because that's where Boston's milk supply, a lot of it came from Westborough. They used to be taking it in a horse and buggy, and somebody got the bright idea, we can make a conglomerate here and ship it by railroad. So let's see.
How about your dad? Tell us a little bit about your dad.
Oh yeah, my dad was born in 1891, and he ended up working in a bank in Worcester. Of course, I have a few artifacts from his bank days in Worcester. He did ride a motorcycle. He rode a 1910 Indian one-cylinder motorcycle, which I have his goggles that he wore in 1910, and I have 3 number plates off of that motorcycle. That's how things get saved in the Hero family, much to Shirley's chagrin. So he worked in this Worcester bank, and one of the things that's interesting about the bank at that time was that how do you identify people? So everybody who was a bank participant, a customer, would have a business card, regular file card, on which they would have their fingerprints. So when a customer came into the bank, they would get his file card out of the card box, and they would have to show a fingerprint on a piece of paper, and the bank tellers had to be able to say if it was the same fingerprint or not.
Yeah.
And I have 100 of those, I think, from customers in the Worcester Bank.
Was that his career as a banker?
No, that's how he started.
That's how he started.
The next thing was, well, actually, it could have been the start of his career as a banker. But the next thing for him was that he joined the Navy in 1918, World War I, and he was stationed at Boston Light, which Shirley and I went out there 5 or 6 years ago. We had never been there, and it was very interesting to know that's where he was. There was a shipwreck while he was stationed at Boston Light. A ship with passengers crashed on the rocks near the lighthouse, and Seaman Hero, which is all he was in the Navy, was a seaman, rowed a dory out to this shipwreck and transported some people to safety.
Great.
It's written up in Edward Rose Snow's
Is it really?
Book of Cape Cod.
Great.
Then he was only there a year or so, and then he got transferred to go on a passenger ship carrying troops. It was a troop ship to take troops over to England and over to France, wherever they landed. And the name of that ship, of course, we know, was the Edward S. Luckenbach, which was a German ship that had been captured by the United States. And he was a quartermaster, and he used to handle the helm on a shift once in a while.
Great. Why don't we turn now just to a little bit about what you remember about Westborough in your early days. And Shirley, you jump in wherever you feel comfortable here now.
I didn't know anything about all those years. So
I know, but I mean, we're moving ahead a little bit now to the
Okay.
point where you were in town and things that you can remember about Westborough in those days.
Okay.
Anything stand out in your mind of major events in town?
Well, what I would say to begin with is that Westborough had been a town of 3,500 people for 100 years, from before the Civil War through World War I. That didn't change. And there was no growth in population that amounted to anything until after World War II. Then what had been beautiful farmland and open space became housing projects all over town, which was still not too bad up until 20 years ago, when they really exploded, maybe 30 years ago. It was a quiet place to live. Westborough was not a noisy place like it is today. So it was peaceful and quiet, and it had the beautiful maple trees and big elm trees all over town. The streets were gorgeous, shaded in the summer. All of that changed in 1938 when we had a hurricane, at which time I was a junior in high school and riding a bike on my paper route, and all of a sudden things started falling down and breaking off and wires pulled down. So I drove down Church Street and I looked, and there was no church steeple on the Congregational Church. So I went and got in the church, went up to see what was going on, and the steeple was laying in the roof. It broke through the roof, not destroying the trusses, but it sure destroyed the roof. The weather vane was out in the parking lot up against the end of the lot. That had got thrown off. And so I stood up in the broken off part of the steeple, and it was like being in a observation deck with a fence all around. It was very interesting, and I took a bunch of pictures of Westborough, including the fact that the Baptist church steeple went across the street, and that was laying over in the cemetery. That was, you could see the way the wind came then. It was kind of southeast.
Yeah, right.
So
I remember, just interrupting, I remember Madeline Hulbert talking about watching that come down. She actually saw it go.
Oh, she saw it come down.
what I like to say before we get too far into what used to be in Westborough is that as the years go by, your memory gets a little fuzzy, but some of the stories get enhanced through the years, so they appear more exciting or real than they really were.
That's right.
And that's a bad thing, but not much you can do about that. So now we had maple trees all over town and elm trees across the street and in people's yards, and it was an awful mess. I think we were without power for about a week at that time. I don't really recall. On our own personal house, where my folks lived, 85 Milk Street, there was a nice greenhouse built in the front corner of the house, and that one came down. It just took it right away. Other than that, they didn't have much of any damage up 85 Milk Street. Other places were really damaged, and I don't want to get confused with the 55 tornado, but again, memory.
Yeah.
But the thing that really was part of my life then was everybody had a furnace in the cellar that burned hard coal that used to get delivered from J.S. Nason Company, and the delivery person, who was Lenny Hutt's father,
Right.
one of them, used to carry these bags of coal on the shoulder. And that looked like an awful dirty job to have. It was very dusty and everything. So what do you do when you need fuel for the furnace and the whole town is full of hardwood trees laying on the ground, and there weren't many chainsaws back in 1938. As I recall, a lot of the rework of those trees was done with a two-man saw or a big single saw. So I don't know how my dad figured it out, but he made arrangements with somebody that we could take all the wood we could find and bring it home. So, being a small town where you knew everybody, there was a man named Fales that lived on Mount Pleasant Street who had a horse. Now, I don't want to get too far into that story, but this was a very fast horse. It had been a race horse or a trotter or something. And he had a wooden buckboard wooden, like a flatbed wagon with sides about 10, 12 inches high. And on the side of that very nice old buckboard, it said Boston Worcester Express. So that had been a real workhorse for getting products into Boston. So he agreed that I could borrow his horse and wagon. So I went up there to get it, and even though I had worked on the farm and we had a big draft horse on the farm and everything, I was a little skittish getting around a horse. And he says, I'm not going to let you take Flora out of here until you know how to hitch her up, how to put her harness on. So I got a pretty fast lesson in how to dress up a horse and how not to be afraid of her. And that was a good experience.
Yeah.
So then I hooked that wagon every day after school. I did that till it got dark. Went all over town where there were logs, some of them too big to lift for sure, but I could get one end up in the back of the wagon and then hoist it in. I had to just take ones I could handle. And for some crazy reason, I don't know why, but every day I did that, I always made one pass down Myrtle Street. As it turns out, that was the house Shirley lived in on Myrtle Street, and I was showing off.
Did it work, Shirley?
At the time, it didn't, no. No.
I don't know that she was too
That one,
impressed.
no, I wasn't, not at all.
But she should have known that I was a very industrious young man.
Yes, right.
So I hauled all that wood up to 85 Milk Street and took it out where we had a whole yard was a garden, but this was liquid gold. So I unloaded the wood in the garden area, and I did that until there just wasn't much of any more wood to pick up. It finally did get pretty well picked up, not cleaned up, but so there was all this wood stacked up like Bob Brown's wood pile up where he does his business. And Carl Henry, who was a Westborough resident, there was no more of them in Westborough, but he was a selectman at one time too. Carl Henry had the farm at 9 Fisher Street, big apple orchard. And he had a sawmill that everything mechanical has always been an interest to me in my life. So they had a 1928 Willis Knight sedan that somebody gave him, and it was a nice automobile. He took it down to Sid Apps, the welder on South Street, where the Westborough Diner is, and old Sid took a torch and he cut that body right off of there and built up a sawmill out of the chassis with the Willis Knight engine. So anyway, Carl Henry brought it down to the house and sawed the wood up into lengths, probably 20-inch lengths, not to measure, but close to that. So that was part of the job done. Then came the next part. We didn't have a nice log splitter like you do, Bob, but we had 3 good steel wedges and a 15-pound sledgehammer.
Yeah.
So I learned how to split logs under my dad's instruction. So the two of us actually worked on that for a long time and tossed a lot of it into the cellar through a window. And we figured at the time we had about 40 cords of wood, which was a lot to pick up in a horse and buggy. But it meant that for 3 years, that's all we burned in the furnace.
Yeah.
Heated the house.
Yeah. Now, were you here? You were here in the '38 hurricane.
Yes, I came to Westborough in 1931, and I was here in the hurricane, yeah,
Yeah,
in '38. It was pretty devastating.
yeah,
We had never been through anything at all
yeah.
like that before, so.
And you were here during the tornado.
Oh, yes, in 1953.
What do you remember about that?
I remember the children had been outside playing, and suddenly it was very eerie color. It was sort of a greenish yellow, and there was thunder and lightning in the distance. And I had all of the children come in. They were small, and suddenly the wind started blowing, and it was just an eerie color.
Yeah.
And Jack was on his way home from work, and he came in the house and closed the front door, and suddenly the door blew open, or he couldn't close it completely, and the trees fell, and windows blew in upstairs, a few trees came down. It was pretty frightening. We stood out, all of us, in the L of the kitchen, which was the worst place to be because there was no roof. It was just a short roof, small roof, rather. It was all over in 3 minutes, but it was so frightening because trees, branches, and crackles, and lightning, and this eerie color, greenish yellow. We didn't know what was happening. Of course, no one had ever
That's right.
been through anything like that in Westborough, and the children were all frightened, and one of our children would not go outside for a long time. He was only 5 years old, and he just would not go out.
Where were
Yeah.
you living then?
Right on West Street.
On West Street.
We had been there only 6 months.
So you were very close to the center of
We
it,
were,
weren't you?
yes, we were just inside the rim.
Yeah.
That was when the high school was damaged. Oh, well, damaged, was blown away practically. And 2 houses above us, there was no damage at all.
Yeah.
We
But then
were
it
on the
swept across
inside
by
perimeter.
Aaronson's.
Yes.
Yeah.
It went, in fact, Jack went over to the school, and that's when he found
Yeah.
the bodies and the devastation. Yeah.
Yeah.
We went up to his parents' home on 85 Milk Street, and they were outside eating their supper. They'd had no idea it was just a thunderstorm as far as they were concerned. But and I have great respect for anyone that's been through a tornado. Not ever having liked thunderstorms anyway, myself, even before that. I still don't like them, but...
You were going to say something, Jack?
Oh, yes. When I got home from work, I just drove in the driveway, and almost as soon as I got home, like Shirley said, the front door wouldn't stay shut because the house was sprung a little. A tree had come down, a maple, big maple again, that was left over from the '38 hurricane, and that maple fell right down the side of the house and took quite a little of the overhang right off of the house. It didn't actually hurt the walls any, but it cleaned off the roof overhang. And what it did, it hit the house so hard. And that section of the house still has just a crawl space under the front hall. It drove the foundation down into the ground, and then the house came back, sprung back up. So there was about a 1-inch gap between the sill and the foundation. So I finally got the front door so it would work, but about every 2 or 3 weeks, it was sticking again. So I finally looked in. I didn't know all this until now, and I looked in that crawl space with a flashlight, and I saw that space there. So what I did, I brought home from work a bunch of 6 by 6 inch aluminum plates, And I got an old building jack from my dad, manual, cranked the jack, and jacked the house up about 1/4 of an inch, and I fit all of these aluminum plates in several sections around this depressed foundation. Then, after I was satisfied that the door worked fine then and didn't change, I crawled in there and packed it with cement, and that's the way it is today.
Great, great.
But the other thing is we had another tree hit the roof and take the chimney off. But again, it didn't go through the roof. And
But we
in my
remember
garage-
all the damage though on South Street and
Oh, yes.
center
my
of
garage
town.
also was
It's okay.
2/3 built, and the wind took that right off the foundation and hit the next door garage. But that was about it for us on
Yeah.
tornado.
Much
count.
more devastation in town. Right?
Tell me, Jack, were you in the service?
Yes,
What branch were you in?
but before I would mention that, I had a couple of things in mind
Okay, excuse me.
about how it used to be in Westborough.
Good,
How
great.
people lived. Well, we lived on 20 Church Street, my mother and dad and I, and had a couple of sisters born there. On the second floor of 20 Church, when we went in there, the whole, my grandmother, Baudelaire, bought that property, and that's why we rented it. We had been living on Central Street. So the whole house, first floor up, including the attic, which was plastered, was all finished with what they call Moresco, which is like a whitewash, because it had been Chauncey Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And down cellar, there was a 12 or 15-foot sign said Chauncey Hospital. Should have been saved for the Hysterical Commission as an archive, but it wasn't. So we had to, well, we did clean first and second floor, did all the work, seeing the grandmother owned it. And we lived there. But what I want to say about living there back in the early 30s was that people didn't have the produce in markets and things that they have today. And one of the things that I didn't really care for was that for cooking eggs, my folks used to buy up a case of eggs or whatever, and we had a big crock down in the cellar filled with water glass. And you'd fill that with eggs, and when my mother wanted to bake something, I had to go down cellar and put my hand in that ice cold, slimy water glass and get the eggs for her.
Yeah.
Another thing that we kept in the cellar, one of the other things, we stored carrots down there in a big bushel box of sand. Had a couple of boxes of sand for carrots. We would get 50 pounds of, or whatever, of potatoes and kept them down cellar. So that was how you kept vegetables, so you could eat them through the year.
Yeah.
And one of the other memories of that era, we had a coal-burning cast iron kitchen stove like everyone else in creation, I guess. Everyone had one of those, which you could burn wood too. So eventually we decided to put in an oil burner. And it was a 2-burner oil burner in the kitchen range. And it had a 5-gallon bottle of oil. The barrel was in the cellar. So that was one of my chores. Bring up the 5 gallons of oil for the kitchen stove.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
about,
Well, I'm glad to hear you work for a living. Tell me about the service now. What did you do in the service?
well, when the war started, I was already working at an aircraft factory in Connecticut, in Stratford, Connecticut. Sikorsky Aircraft,
Yeah.
which became Vought Sikorsky, which became Chance Vought. And we built observation planes and then ended up in the fighter planes, and the F-4U-1 Corsair was one of our, I worked in the experimental department, and we built 3 or 4 different models of airplanes, but that particular one ended up to be a high production airplane. And one thing that's very interesting is that when we finished the first 3, one of them to be destroyed in test, see how much it could stand, and the other 2 were used to improve the quality of the product. So it finally went into production. And I didn't work in production, but when they were ready to deliver the first airplane to the U.S. Navy, they decided that they would let the company employees pay for it and give it to the Navy. So as a result, I have a stock certificate that says I own 1 share of stock in the Corsair.
Yeah, great.
So that was interesting.
Did you fly in the Navy?
Well, I'm getting up
okay.
there. Kind of slow, huh?
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to give me a punch, not just a wink at me. Sure. Anyway, because I was in the war industry building airplanes, they gave me what you call a 2B deferment, so I couldn't get drafted. So.
You tried, though.
Huh?
You tried.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, I went to a Navy enlisting place and said where I was, and I said, but they're after me, and they're going to draft me one of these days, and I don't want to wait. I want to enlist in the Navy. So I enlisted, because back then in World War II, almost every young fellow just wanted to get into the action and save the world, or save the country anyway. So they did let me enlist, and I was put on the reserve temporarily instead of being assigned immediately. So I left the factory and I went to a flight school where they taught flying Piper Cubs and so forth, and had to wait until we were called because we had a special classification. Again, working in the flight training, that was more important than putting me on active duty, which is a good thing because I'm here.
That's right.
Anyway, that went on for a while, and finally I got a letter to report down to, I can't think of the building, there's the memory, in Boston, where everybody had to report, and there were a whole bunch of us in this big auditorium, and they called them up by name, one at a time. Well, that list got pretty long and the crowd got pretty small, and it wasn't too long before I looked around and I'm the only one sitting there. So I went up to the desk where the captain was, and he says, "Who are you?" So I wasn't on the list. So I said, I got a letter. I had the letter, and I said, here, I was called to active duty. Here's my orders. And he said, well, I can't really do anything about that because you're not in this section, this conscription group. So I went back home. but I had already sold my car, had my going away party, and the only thing I took with me, I think, was a toothbrush. So I went back home, and I was very depressed about the, well, not depressed, but a little upset.
Yeah, sure.
So I wrote a letter to Admiral Louis Denfeld, who had been an associate of my dad back in high school days and a friend of the family, and Shirley knew his wife and all this stuff. So I wrote the letter to Louis Denfeld, and he wrote a letter to this captain in Boston ordering him to get me in the service. So I got another letter. I went right back to Boston, and this same guy was there. And he had his letter out. And he said, "Young man, I can put you on active duty right now. But if you do it, you're going to be sorry every day that you ever spent in the U.S. Navy. So what I want you to do is go right back and wait until a group comes through that we can establish you to go in with." So that scared me a little, and I decided not to take Admiral Denfeld's orders. And so anyway, they finally did call me, and I went to Florida and ended up in the training command of fighter pilots. I had already got a pilot's license before World War II, but just a solo permit. I didn't have a private, but I had already learned how to fly an airplane, but they had too many pilots then, and they weren't taking anymore. So I was in the mechanical as a flight engineer or combat air crewman, the 2 or 3 titles.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was only in the Navy for about 3 years before the war ended, but I wanted to get overseas something awful when I'm down in this flight training school.
Do you remember in Westborough, like 4th of July and Memorial Day and those sorts of things? Are there any things that stand out in your mind?
I could tell.
Yeah.
About 1931, when I came to Westborough, I lived on the borders, Westborough and Southborough, and there was an elder, well, to me he was elderly, but he probably wasn't. His name was George Claypool, and he lived on Smith Street. And so 4th of July, he would round up all the neighborhood children, and we would ride down to Chauncey, and we would take a swim. That's all I remember about that particular time. There were also celebrations at the Ullman farm. It's the only time I ever won anything. I won.
You got me.
No, it's another story. There was a sack bag race, a 3-legged race.
Yeah.
And I was a winner with someone else, and I won a fountain pen, which was really something at the time. That's the only time I ever won anything.
Yeah.
Also, 4th of July was always a celebration in town.
Yeah.
We would have a parade, firecrackers, and it was just a fun time. I just remember that up until I was 12 years old, and I don't know what happened after that.
Where did they have the fireworks?
Not when I say fireworks, I don't mean
just firecrackers. Okay.
like down in the Charles. I don't mean that. Sparklers.
Yeah. Okay.
Firecrackers. That. Do you remember fireworks?
I think in Forbes Field, which is where the Commons
I don't remember that.
Mall is now. That was the football field for Westborough High behind the community house.
Right.
And I think that's where we had our fireworks.
Did you?
No, I don't remember the fireworks
But they
at
weren't
all.
tremendous. They were
Yeah.
just kind of fun.
Yeah.
I was telling somebody the other day that one of the reasons that the 4th of July parades were big and fun then was it was not too long after World War I, so there were a lot of veterans.
Two, really. There. World War II, you're talking about, or one?
World War
Oh,
I.
all right.
When
I
we
guess
were
that's
kids.
right. Okay.
And my dad had been in World War I, of course, and so the American Legion, not quite at that time, but later they had a champion drum corps that traveled a few times around the country. But right then they were having very fancy parades, and one of them was a buggy, fancy buggy like George Washington sitting in. I don't know who the passenger was, but my dad was leading the team of horses so they wouldn't get too frisky. And one of the horses stepped on his foot, and he was in pain, but he kept marching. But he got out of that all right.
Yeah.
I don't remember any other public holidays at that time.
Yeah. Okay.
Early.
Yeah.
Because World War II started, well, of course it started in 41, but there were rumors before that. There wasn't much celebration.
Yeah.
I don't remember anything else during that time.
Well, you've been great citizens in this town. As you look at it now, what would you like to see happen to make it better?
I'd like to point out a couple of the old town things before that, if
Okay.
you can let me speak a little
I
more.
will do that.
I just told you before, the town was very quiet and peaceful and pretty. But every morning at 6 a.m. and every evening at 6 p.m., the Angelus, the Catholic Church bell would ring. So you get the 3 rings and the pause and then the 3 rings. They did that 3 or 4 times, and then they just ring steady for a while. I don't know what the whole prayer was all about, but that was interesting. At the same time, every church used to ring a bell on Sunday, and we had a rope pull on our bell, which I've seen up front and personal a few times, and it got so you could hang onto that rope and ride up
Hit the
to
ceiling.
because that bell was heavy and it would pull you right off the floor, so
Yeah.
you had to wait till it was ready to pull. But the other thing about the town, besides the Angelus ringing twice a day, every noontime that fire whistle would blow. They call it a whistle, it's really a horn.
Right.
Blow a nice long note, so you knew it was noontime.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
Do you remember, are you interested in anything that happened at the high school
Sure.
in those years?
Sure.
Up until 1940, we had, I graduated in 1940, that's why I remember, we had what we called Kiwanis Capers. It was the big entertainment for the town, and we had it at the what's called, where the police station is now. So we had it on that stage. And I was in a group of 3 that sang, and that was fun, but there were just little acts put on by the school, and not necessarily the school. It would be the town, but it was the big entertainment time of the year. It was usually in May, Kiwanis Capers,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes it would be held in the town hall. It was either the high school or the town hall where we had plays, rather than, of course, at the new high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
That was
bring up a couple of
not
these
too many.
old-time things
Not too
keep
many there.
coming up. People used to have milk delivered in quart bottles of Fay's Dairy. Pete Fay, Carol Fay still live in town, but their father had H. Kendall Fay,
I remember.
had a dairy, and he had a pasteurizing plant. So that was state of the art for the business. And in fact, the milk bottles even were embossed with his name, raised letters on the milk bottles. If you can find them today in an antique shop, you get a treasure.
Mm-hmm.
But he delivered milk, Kendall Fay did, very early in the morning. So, and the milk was in a quart bottle with just a paper cap stuck in the top. And if in the wintertime, you could go out there and you would, someone had left the milk out for 2 or 3 hours, the cream froze, so the cap was up in the air about 1.5 inches.
I remember that, sure.
And the cats would go and lick the cream. So in the wintertime, he couldn't use his wagon he had for delivering milk. I think it was an old truck, I don't quite remember, but in the wintertime, he had a flatbed sleigh, great big flatbed sleigh, and he had the bottles all covered up so they wouldn't freeze. And a single horse drove that around town. And I have talked to Carol Fay since, because I wanted to find out a couple of details. And he told me that that old sled was out behind Fay's Dairy on East Main for years, and he says it got to be really unsightly. It was falling apart, so he transported it up to the farm because Fay's Dairy didn't have any cows on East Main Street.
Right.
They had a farm way out West Main Street near the Grafton line, and another family lived there and ran the farm. So Carol put the sleigh up there, and in later years it just rotted away. So that was another thing that was interesting at the time. And even earlier than that, when I had a paper route, I used to deliver a paper to the Westborough Chronotype, which they don't publish anymore, do they?
No.
Anyway, it was upstairs over what was the Piccadilly pub on Main Street there for a while, but that was also an interesting shop. A fellow had a woodworking shop there. But upstairs in the Chronotype where they manufactured it, a fellow named Earl Pratt ran the linotype machine. And he sat there and he could be talking to me while I'm interested in what he's doing, and he's typing the newspaper. He had to type every single word that was in the newspaper, and it wasn't on paper with a spell check or anything. It was making little lead slugs.
Right.
And the machine would stop, so you would have to go to the next line, and those lead slugs would fall down into a tray, and that tray would end up, 15, 18 inches long, all loaded with these lead slugs. And they'd put that in the press. And of course, I wasn't a proofreader like Shirley, but I don't remember any real misspelling in any of the newspapers. So that was amazing to see that.
Yeah.
So that's probably enough for the old memories.
You're still talking about the World War II? Are you still?
Well, I really think we're going to close up, but I would like you to say anything you'd want to about how you think the town could be improved. You've lived here a long time. You remember the older days. It's a different town now.
One other thing you should know, though, was when we were in high school, I was a senior, Shirley was a junior, the Hindenburg
There you go. Right.
Zeppelin was making a tour of the United States, and the rumors were they were photographing industry all over the country so they'd know good bomb targets and so forth.
But we didn't know that at the time.
No, that was
course
just a
not.
rumor,
Yeah.
but not then. So the school let us all out. It was, I think, about 1 o'clock. After the lunch hour ended, all the public schools were let out, and we were out in Parkman Street, and that Zeppelin came over there so low that you felt you could almost reach up. And it was so big that it took a long time before it was
I can still see
passed
it.
over us.
Yeah, that
It was really
I
interesting.
can still see it.
Then it ended up in New Jersey and it blew up. That was the end of Zeppelins for a
And that was the
while.
same flight, wasn't it? It was going
It's
back.
the same
Same
flight.
flight,
It's
yeah.
going back.
Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
now you asked what we might do to improve the town. Well, one thing about the way the town operates in its committees and selectmen and so forth, I have suggested, and nobody ever thought it was a very good idea, I guess, because it hasn't happened, that when somebody comes into town, he's a builder and he wants to buy this land and he wants to build a series of houses or something else, he goes to the planning board or he goes to the selectmen, and they start him through all these committees, the planning board and I don't know what the name of all the committees are,
Yeah.
but if you look at the papers, you'll see that everybody who's trying to build anything in this town, they have to go month after month to these special meetings, and sometimes it takes them a long time. So my suggestion was take one person from every committee that's going to be involved in these plans and this project, and let this guy give his pitch to all of the committees at once, so at least they all have an idea what he's up to. I think that would cut the
Yeah.
time to get a permit a lot.
Good. Good.
I had a couple other things about politics in town, but
I'm not thinking about politics. Actually, of course, I get upset with the traffic, but I don't know what I would do to change the town. Every town grows,
Yeah.
hopefully, and we do too.
Sure.
But I gripe like anyone else going through town with traffic.
Yeah.
But if I had to pin it down, no, not.
It's still a pretty
not-
great town, isn't it?
It's been a pretty good town, not after all these years. It's changed, yes.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate your taking the time to reminisce with us. It's been a lot of fun. We've learned a lot.
it's brought a lot of
think-
memories to surface for me,
That's great.
and I enjoyed it, Bob.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for coming.